Hey guys, this is Adam Chomsky, and in this tutorial I'm going to show you some advanced techniques for stabilizing a hyperlapse. So first thing I'm going to do is double click here on my project window to open up and to import some images. I'm going to import some images of a hyperlapse I shot at the Supreme Court, and since I have my images stored as named as a numbered sequence, it's automatically going to select JPEG sequence here. So when I hit open, it's going to be a sequence of images. So I'm going to drag this down into create a new sequence button, and it's going to pop up, and if I control K I can see the settings of this one. This is 5184 by 3456. This is an 18 megapixel image, and that's the size of my sequence here. So this hyperlapse is a little tricky because at this point here there's a tree that comes right through the middle of the image and it blocks the background, and there's no single tracking point I can pick anywhere on this image that is going to be available in every frame because this tree gets in the way. So first thing I like to do is I always just try to run warp stabilizer and just see if it's going to work. So let's try that out and just see what happens. Okay, so warp stabilizer actually does a pretty decent job. It's not too bad. It gets a little wobbly when it goes behind the tree there. See, that damn tree screws up warp stabilizer just like it's going to screw us up when we try to manually stabilize. So if I was going to keep warp stabilizer, what I would want to do is I'd want to do stabilize only. I don't want it cropping and auto scaling. So by default, the stabilization method chosen is subspace warp, but there's also some other options in here. Subspace warp sometimes produces some weird artifacts. Like I'll show you an example of a case where it's producing all kinds of jello type warping artifacts on the screen. So if I was going to use this as my jumping off point to do some manual stabilization afterward, I usually disable subspace warp, just because if it produces those jello effects, then it could be really hard to get rid of it. So I would choose position, scale, and rotation. See, now there seems to be some jitters here in the scaling, which I don't care for. It might be kind of difficult to fix that. Warp stabilizer has introduced some scaling disturbances here. Right when it goes behind the tree, it seems like it's rescaling it. Unfortunately, I think this is a really annoying feature. I cannot tell warp stabilizer to do position and rotation only without doing the scale, and I find that sometimes warp stabilizer introduces scaling that I don't want, but if I just select position, there's all kinds of rotation wobbles in there, and position by itself doesn't do much if you have a lot of rotation wobbles. So this is not really helping me. So I could choose to do position, scale, and rotation and stabilize only, and take this output and then put it into my next step and try to manually stabilize from there. But in this case, I think I'm just going to delete warp stabilizer and start fresh and do a manual stabilization starting out. Also, sometimes warp stabilizer produces just terrible results that are totally unusable, so I'll show you how to start stabilizing from scratch. So if you don't have the tracker panel down here, go to Window and select Tracker, and that should pop up. And then I'm going to select Track Motion. So I'm going to show you 3 different ways that you can deal with this kind of stabilization, because as I mentioned, there's no single tracking point I can pick here that's going to be in every single frame. So I'm going to have to do something special to deal with this tree. I'm going to show you 3 different ways to do it. So here's the first one. In the first one, I'm going to do it in 2 stages. First, I'm going to do position tracking and then rotation tracking separately. So the advantage of that is when you're doing position tracking, you only have to pick one point. If you're going to do position and rotation in one stage, you have to pick 2 points in every frame, and it can be more challenging to find a suitable tracking point, or set of tracking points rather. So in this case, let me go back and change my resolution to full so that this image is sharp. I'm going to drag my tracking point. I think a good tracking point is going to be the peak of the roof here, which is visible in most of the frames, even though it's partially obscured here. You can still pretty much tell where it is. So the tracking point is going to look for an image that looks like this, which isn't very helpful because there's these branches in the way. and it's going to look for it within this larger bounding box. That's what the bounding boxes are for here. So I'm on frame 1. Let me click this down so I can see I like to see which keyframes I've already used. I'm just going to make sure that this tracking point stays on the peak of the building in each frame. And I'm using the Analyze One Frame Forward button to move forward one frame at a time. Also, there's the Analyze Forward button, which will keep on moving until you stop it. So until I get out from behind this tree, the automatic picking is going to have a tough time figuring this out. So now it's figuring it out pretty well. Oops. So when I see that it's gone off track, I just need to stop it with the space bar, or with the Analyze Forward button will turn into a stop button, and just make sure I get it back on track, and then it can process forward again. Okay, so now I've reached the point where my tracking point has gone behind this tree. It's somewhere back here. And for the next few frames, I can page down and look at the next few frames. It's visible in that one, but there's several in a row here where I'm not going to be able to see it. So what I want to do here is, this keyframe is bad. I want to delete that keyframe. So I'm just going to expand this and select this keyframe data and delete it. And so at this point, this is the last good keyframe I can get out of this tracking point. So now I'm going to have to pick a new tracking point, but I can't just move this one because obviously it's tracking a particular point in space. So I'm going to do a new stabilize motion, and it's going to give me tracker 2. I'm going to pick position again, just position. So now I have to pick a new point, and I want to pick a point that's going to be available for the next few frames. So I'm going to go somewhere over here, top of this pillar somewhere, like right here, maybe. I don't want to pick something that's too far off center, because this lens is kind of a wide angle lens, and there's some distortion, especially near the edges of the lens, and I don't want to be too far away from the center of the image. So I'm going to pick a tracking point over here. I'll get a few frames out of it before the tree will cover this one up. But let me zoom in here. So the last keyframe of tracker 1 is going to correspond to the first keyframe of tracker 2. They're going to overlap by 1 frame. So let's just step through this. Okay, so that's about as far as I can go before this tracking point is going to go behind the tree. And my original tracking point is still not visible, so I'm just going to create another tracker, tracker 3, again position only. And this time I'm going to put it over on this side. Maybe I'll just do the top of this pillar here. Oops. And analyze forward a few frames. Again, we have 1 frame of overlap here. The tracker 2, the last frame of tracker 2 is the same as the first frame of tracker 3. And oh, that's convenient. I picked a good spot, huh? There's a leaf covering it in the second frame. Okay, now I can see my original point again. So I don't want to continue on track point 1. I'm going to create another track point. It'll just be tracker 4. Again, position only. And put it up here. And again, overlap by 1 frame. Oops. Okay. So now I have all my tracking points set up. So if I go select tracker 1, so current track is tracker 1, and I had this set to transform. Maybe I accidentally hit track motion instead of stabilize motion. I meant to hit stabilize motion, but no problem. I just hit stabilize here and then hit apply, and I'm going to go to X and Y direction. So X is horizontal, Y is vertical direction. So I want to apply to both. Then I can go to tracker 2. I have to set the motion source here, tracker 2, apply tracker 2, and I'll apply tracker 3. and apply tracker 4. Okay, let me down-res this a bit. Let's do a RAM preview and see how that looks. So it's still pretty shaky, but the important point to look at is this peak right here stays pretty much exactly in place. And I have not corrected the rotation yet, so what we have here is rotation wobbles mostly. So you can see there's a few spaces. Let me try to go back and find them. There's a few spots where this thing doesn't look like it's very precise, like right there. This frame right here seems to be a little bit off. So what I can do is go back to tracker 4. Let's look at tracker 4. Oh, let me set my resolution to full so we can see clearly. And I can zoom in closely. I can see that this point is a little bit off. So let me just move it back into place. That's no problem. And then I can just apply tracker 4 again. And then that should have smoothed that out. Okay, so if I put my cursor there near the peak, you can see it's pretty good. Okay, so that's a pretty good first step. But obviously we have the rotation to fix. Okay, so one thing I want to check out before I move on to the next step is this is going just a little bit outside the frame. A mistake I made on my last tutorial is I forgot to change the size of the composition so that to make sure that this image isn't getting cropped. It's getting cropped only a tiny bit here, but I'll just kind of increase the size a little bit and just try to make sure that the image isn't getting cropped here. It's still getting cropped a little bit. Let me make the height a little bit bigger. And just trying to keep this thing within the frame. Okay, so it can be extra large. The composition can be extra large. That doesn't matter as long as it's not cropping our image. Okay, so the next step is I want to go back to our project, and this is our composition. I want to drag the composition down to the new composition button. So now we have another new composition. And we don't have any of our tracking points or any of our transform information in here, so we can start fresh with the position already stabilized. So in this case, now all I have to do is stabilize the rotation and not the position. So I'm going to hit stabilize motion. I'm going to select rotation and I'm going to uncheck the position. Let me make sure my quality is full so I can see what I'm doing here. Now in this case I want to choose a pair of tracking points that are on ideally a vertical line, so we have a lot of good candidates here, these vertical pillars here. Or if it's a horizontal line, it should be near the height of the camera. If it's not vertical and it's not horizontal near the height of the camera, as I pan around, the angle of these things will change, and then you'll end up with if you were tracking a line that wasn't horizontal, you'd end up with an image that just rotated further and further, and it would end up all crooked at the end, which is fixable. I'm going to show you how to fix that later if you have to do that as a last resort, but we're going to try to avoid that by picking some vertical lines. So let me go back to my tracker. Okay, so track point 1 and track point 2. Let me pick the left side of this pillar. Seems like a nice good spot to pick. A nice vertical line. And the points that you pick don't have to be exactly the same from frame to frame. So I could move this box up and down anywhere on this pillar as long as it stays on this pillar, on the edge of this pillar, as long as the angle is consistent from frame to frame. You want to try and pick parts that are as far away as you can get them, because if you are off by a couple of pixels or something, if the points are very close together, a couple of pixels can make a big difference in the angle, and it can make your rotation tracking less consistent and less smooth. If the points are far apart, being off by 1 or 2 pixels isn't going to be such a big deal. So I've picked a couple of points. Here's a tip. You can do click on this little arrow here and go to New Layer Viewer. And if I want to check 2 points at the same time and zoom way in so that I can see just how accurate the tracking is, I can do that, and I can control the zoom of the two views independently as well. So I'm just going to start tracking forward and picking points here. One of the things, unfortunately, if you have two windows open, only the active one updates if you hit the Analyze Forward button. So you have to see now this one, I think it's either off or it's gone behind the trees. So I have to stop it every once in a while and just kind of check the other point if I'm hitting the Analyze Forward button and just make sure that both of these points are accurate. Now I've made the bounding boxes very wide because I don't want the points moving too far up or down the pillar. I want them mostly to just, they tend to drift up and down the pillars, and I don't want them drifting too close together. So I mostly just am concerned about being somewhere on the pillar and don't drift too far up or down. Now at this point my bottom point is blocked. My bottom tracking point is blocked behind this thing. Oops, undo that. It's fine, I can just move it up the pillar. I still have a pretty sizable vertical line here to work with. And I'm going to move it back down as soon as I get past that obstruction, just so that I have the longest line I can for more accuracy in the rotation stabilization. So here you can really see the advantages of doing rotation only. When obstructions get in the way, I simply move the points to a different point on this pillar, and it's still going to work for me. Okay, so here's a case where the entire side of this pillar has been obstructed. So what I'm going to do is, since I'm doing rotation stabilization only, I can simply pick another pillar. And because of the thing I mentioned earlier about the lens producing warping, especially toward the edges, I'm going to try to stay toward the middle and pick another pillar that's nearby. And now that this lamppost in the foreground is obstructing this pillar, I'll just move back to my original pillar. Okay, so now I've reached a point where the tree is going to be blocking this tracking point, this set of tracking points, but just like before, all I have to do is scoot these over to a different pillar and continue tracking. So again, now the tree is blocking that pillar, so I'm going to move this over to another pillar. Okay, that's all the tracking points are in place now. Oops, didn't mean to click that. Okay, so now I only have one tracker. I'm going to apply it. Okay, so what's going to happen here is this is not going to work, but I wanted to show you what happens if you simply do rotation, position tracking first and then rotation tracking. Let me just do the first, show the first second. Now, it looks not too bad, but if you notice, this point that we had nice and stable before is kind of wobbling around now. Well, what happened? It was perfectly stable. So I'll show you what happened here. When you rotate, okay, so this point here, that thing is your anchor point. So when you rotate this image, let me just take this rotation thing, it rotates around that point. So in each case, we're adjusting the rotation, but we don't want it to rotate around this point. We want it to rotate around the tracking point that we picked before. So let me go back to the first frame, and if I press Y, or you can just select this pan behind tool here, and pick your anchor point, and I want to move it. Oops, where did it go? It can be tricky to see sometimes. I want to move it up to our tracking point that we picked before. Let me get rid of all this rotation data, and I can pick a more clear frame. Okay, so that's about where we need it to be, and I just hit V to go back to the selection tool. Okay, so now that's my tracking point. Now I want to apply again my stabilization, my rotation stabilization. And send this back to quarter. And let's take a look at how it looks now. Hey, it's looking much better. So if I put my cursor near the peak there, it is staying pretty steady except for a couple of places where I probably had a bad tracking points that I could still go back and adjust, but I don't think that will necessarily be required at this point, because the next step I'm going to try to do is, since we have this pretty well stabilized now, we might be able to get rid of these last little bit of jitters by running it through Warp Stabilizer. I like to try that again once I get it pretty stable, because it's a lot easier for Warp Stabilizer to take care of an image like this than the original one I had, which was jumping all over the place. So let me just, first I want to drop this into another new composition, and then on that composition I'm going to run Warp Stabilizer, and we'll see what it does. So Warp Stabilizer produced a pretty nice result. It looks pretty good and smooth. The only thing I can see is there's a little bit of it looks like there's a kind of a smooth zoom out and back in just after it passes the tree. I want to see if I can get rid of the auto scale, just stabilize. Let me just do stabilize only. See what that looks like. Huh. Well, it still seems to have that little bit of wobble just after it passes the tree. It's not too bad. You could try to fix that by just doing a scale only. Just do manual tracking. Just do like I would drop this into another subcomposition and only do a tracking point from maybe, you know, right around here. Maybe try to pick a couple of points on a pillar and just do stabilize motion and just do scale only, because everything else is pretty smooth. Go back and change this to full. And I would just pick a point at the top of the pillar and point at the bottom of the pillar. See if we can smooth this out. Okay, I think that's probably far enough. And just apply that. And I'm just going to shrink this down to the region we're interested in, and do a quick preview in there and see how that looks. It's got a subtle little shaking going on still, but it's not too bad. You could probably mess around with some tracking points and try to clean that up a little bit more, but it's pretty good for our purposes here. Okay, so now the only thing left to do is, because I had these black borders in my composition to begin with, Warp Stabilizer couldn't crop them out because it didn't really know where the end of my image was. So I kind of need to manually crop that out. I'm going to go to composition settings. I want to change my resolution anyway because I want to deliver 1920 by 1080, full 1080p resolution. So obviously this is way too big. I can scale this down. If you hold down Control and move the scale, it moves slower. If you hold down Shift, it moves faster. So that's just a kind of a general tip for any kind of sliders you're moving in After Effects. Change this up to full. So maybe just a little bigger. Whoops. Well, what I forgot to do here is I forgot that this was already scaled. So what I could do, I already have a bunch of tracking points for scale. So what I can do here is I could create a subcomposition for this, or I'll show you another trick if you don't already know about null objects. You can just go to Layer, New, Null Object, and then take this little guy, this pick whip. I think if that's not visible, you might have to expand or collapse the layer switch pane with that button, and then just take the pick whip from my composition here and pick it to the null object. So at this point I can adjust the scale of the null object, and it will adjust the scale of my composition along with it. And that allows me to do an independent adjustment of the scale without messing up these other scales that are already in there. So let's take a look at how this is looking. So that's looking pretty good. I would like to adjust this down a little bit. I feel like it's pointing a little too high. I can just adjust my my null object, and it'll also likewise adjust my background layer. So there we go. I think this is pretty much done. Okay, so I'm also going to show you another technique. So in the first technique, I did position tracking first and then rotation separately. But I'm going to show you another technique where you can do position and rotation tracking together and do multiple trackers to get around this tree. Okay, so let me just start by taking my original images and dropping it into a new composition. And I'm going to rename this as Technique 2. Alright, so in this case I'm going to do stabilize motion, and I'm going to select position and rotation. So I want to choose a couple of points that are ideally on a vertical surface, or on a vertical line. So again, we have the columns that are a pretty good choice. So in this case, position or tracking point 1 is critical that it's in the same spot in each frame. I cannot float up and down the pillar like we did before, because position point or tracking point 1 is used for not just for rotation, but also that's your position tracking point. Tracking point 2 is used only for the rotation, so it can float up and down on the pillar as long as it doesn't go left or right. That's fine. Tracking point 1 is the more important one. So I'm just going to analyze forward. Okay, so now I've reached a point where tracking point 1 is about to go behind a tree. So what I'm going to do is just hit stabilize motion again, and it's going to bring up a new tracker. Now it's tracker 2, and I want the first frame of tracker 2 to correspond to the last frame of tracker 1, so they should overlap by 1 frame. So I'm going to check position and rotation again, and this time I'm just going to choose a different pillar. Let's move over a few pillars. Oops. Just choose a point there. Let's see. So now I've reached the point where this tracker is about to go, or this tracking point is about to go behind this tree. In the next frame, it's totally behind the tree. So now I need to choose another tracking point, or another motion tracker. So I'm going to hit stabilize motion again, choose position and rotation, and I'm going to overlap them by 1 frame again, and choose a new tracking point. So I'm just going to move over here and choose a different pillar. Okay, I think that's far enough. So now I'm going to go and apply tracker 1 and just hit apply to X and Y direction. Okay. And now this first section should be smoothed out. Let me select it. Do quarter resolution. And we'll just take a look at how that looks. So that's pretty well smoothed out. So now I'm going to apply tracker 2. Oops, tracker 2, apply, okay. And now this second section should be smoothed out, but I'm going to show you what happens here. I'm going to do a RAM preview of that. Okay, so what happened here? In each frame during tracker 1, the image moves further and further to the right, and then it jumps back into place. So what happens here is when you apply position and rotation stabilization, it creates 3 sets of keyframes for anchor point, position, and rotation. Now position, it only gives you one keyframe, and then that keyframe is supposed to be the same in each frame of this tracker. Then when you apply tracker 2, it gives you a new position keyframe, but it's not in the same place as the first one. So what happens when you have two position keyframes that are not in the same place and they're separated by some space in the timeline is After Effects automatically creates a smooth pan from one to the other. And so we don't want it to do that. We don't want it to move. We want the position to be the same through all of these frames. So I'm going to select this position keyframe so it's yellow, Control C to copy it, and then bring it to the end just before the next position keyframe, and Control V to paste it there. So now let me do a RAM preview. Now we've gotten rid of that drifting problem. So now I'm going to apply stabilizer 3, or tracker 3, apply that, X and Y, okay. And it's going to be the same problem again. Let me do a RAM preview to show you what it looks like. So now during tracker 2, it moves to the right, or to the left, I mean, in every frame until you get to tracker 3, and then it jumps back into place, and then it's okay after that. So again, we're going to do the same thing. Copy the position keyframe and paste it here one frame before the next position keyframe that was set up by tracker 3. So let me do a RAM preview of this. Okay, there you have it. Get past that tree nice and smooth now. So you still have the option of taking this one and dropping it into a new composition and then running warp stabilizer on the output there. Oops. New composition, and then run warp stabilizer on that one to smooth it out a little further. Okay, one more thing I wanted to discuss, and that is if you cannot find 2 points on a vertical surface and you just can't find anything that's suitable and you need to pick another straight line or another couple of points to do motion tracking on to stabilize your rotation, you'll end up with your image getting crooked a lot of times, and I'll show you how to fix that. So I'll just go and do stabilize motion, and I'll do position and rotation. I'll go in and put some points in here to stabilize position and rotation, and I'll show you what happens and how to fix it. I'm going to choose 2 points on the edge of this roof, which is obviously not a vertical image or a vertical line, and it's not a horizontal line that's anywhere near the height of the camera. So this thing's going to get crooked in short order. Okay, so I've got a bunch of tracking points on here, and I'm just going to apply this to X and Y direction, and we'll see what it looks like. So as you can see, the further along you go, it's pretty well stabilized, but the further along you go, by the time you get to the end, this image is pretty crooked. It's obviously nowhere near straight. But if I try to just take the rotation and fix it, well, that doesn't work because I have all these other rotation points already set. So there's no good way for me to just move those directly. So what I'm going to do is go Layer, New, Null Object, and take the pick whip here and parent my composition to the null object, or I could just pick it from this drop-down list. And again, if you don't see that, you might have to push this button to bring up some additional, oh, well, one of these buttons here brings up additional settings here. Okay, so the null object, I can just take this null object, and to animate the rotation keyframes, just push the stopwatch button, and by the time we get to the end, I can hold down Control so I can do fine rotation correction here, rotate it back correctly, and then as you get to a certain point, I'm going to hit Control R to bring up the ruler, and I want to make sure this is vertical, so along the way I might have to fix the rotation at a couple of points and just try to make sure that stays pretty close to vertical. Might want to just move it a little bit that way. So as this moves along, just kind of make sure that stays vertical. Okay, that looks pretty close. So now if I do a RAM preview, so now it's pretty stable, and I've fixed the tilting problem we had. I'm not going to do the whole composition, but you get the idea of how it works. So in some cases, depending on how far you're pivoting around your subject, the rotation can be quite extreme, and you might have to do quite a bit of rotation back with the null object to get it straight again. Okay, so that's about it. Those are my tips for some more advanced stabilization techniques. When warp stabilizers doesn't work, when you don't have easy, convenient points that you can pick in every single frame, when you have to do it a little bit more piecemeal, and come up with some other techniques to get it to work. So I hope this has been helpful, and thanks for watching.